Actually, I think it's more evident that for the majority of Americans and the majority of people around the world, economic conditions are not favorable because their cost of living has been going up more than their salaries, than their compensation. So there are many surveys in the US which seem to indicate that about 2/3 of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And I live here in Asia, and I can observe the Asian economies fairly well because I travel and I go out and I mix with people. I mean, the Thai economy is probably the worst in Asia, and the stock market has performed also miserably, but it's still kind of indicative. I have a friend, he has a restaurant, and he told me his figures precisely over the last few years. Say, after COVID, the traffic in his restaurant increased, and this year, May, June, is the worst he's had on record. And another friend of mine, don't think that I only have friends who have restaurants and bars, but I have quite a few of those. Another one, he owns a bar, and his business, he also said, is the worst he can remember in May, June. And another bar I know, which typically does fairly well, I went last night. Last night it rained very heavily until about, say, 9 o'clock at night. But I usually go out around 11:30 at night, and that place was empty. And then they have a boxing stadium here in Chiang Mai, as an example. They have Thai boxing matches here, but around the boxing stadium or the court, the boxing ring, there are many bars. They were, more than half empty. So the business isn't very good. Tourism, relatively speaking, is doing okay, but it's not back to the level of 2018, 2019. It's still down about 30% from those times, also in Vietnam. So all I'm saying is, when you look at the stock market, you would think the economy is booming. The economy is booming for the 1% or 10% of the population. The 10% of the population owns almost 80% of all stocks in the US. So for these people, the economy is booming, but not for the working man. Inflation only happens for one reason, and the reason is an irresponsible, incompetent government. If the government doesn't want inflation, it can do it by essentially not having any fiscal deficits. A fiscal deficit, by definition, is inflationary, but it is in particular inflationary if the central bank finances the deficit, which has happened in the US. Well, who knows what will happen? But I see more and more people, and I tend to agree with the theory. Look, Mark, the governments will keep on printing money. The purchasing power of money will continue to depreciate. As long as governments print money, stocks will have a rising tendency. That is correct. Now, the question is that stocks, especially in the US, among the, say, Magnificent Seven, semiconductors and so forth, these stocks, they have a relatively high valuation or extremely high valuation. So even with money printing, stocks may not go up a lot. And as we've seen today, as an example, the CPI came out and it was perceived to be better than expected. Now, the CPI, the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculate the CPI is very questionable. So whether the inflation that they publish is reflecting the economic reality on the ground or not is a different question. In general, my sense is that prices are going up much more than what the Bureau of Labor Statistics seems to suggest. But anyway, the market is the market, and the investment community likes to believe what is good, so bonds rallied. But at the same time, the dollar went down. You understand? If a country like the US decides to print money, they can print money like in Turkey Turkey and in Argentina and so forth. Over time, the currency will then depreciate. The question is by how much? And my view would be that if the US embarks on quantitative easing, if they cut interest rates, in my view, the dollar will begin to weaken considerably. The question will then arise, well, weaken against what? Because the other currencies are not much better. But my view is that it will weaken against Bitcoins. Not that I'm bullish about Bitcoins, but the market will perceive a weakening dollar as being positive for Bitcoins, and it will weaken against precious metals, gold, silver, platinum, which I suggest people hold to a certain extent. Not all the money they have in gold, silver, and platinum, but a large percentage, say 20-30%. Well, it ran up and then it came down again recently. It is, I think, at about an all-time low relative to gold. It's quite remarkable. Well, the world is increasingly divided in two blocks. The Anglo-Saxon bloc under the leadership of the US and Europe plus Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. The so-called advanced economies, the former colonial powers. They haven't been able to shake their idea of supremacy entirely and still travel around the world and lecture countries like China and India about human rights and democracy, and then you have the countries that are represented more by the BRICS countries, China, India, Russia, and so forth. These are economically new countries on the block in the international trading system. They weren't involved in international trade until just the last 30-40 years. And these countries have become economically very powerful. They also include 80% or close to 90% of the world's population. These countries have a different view of the American neocon view of the world, where the world should be ruled by America because America is the best option for the world. This, rightly or wrongly, you understand? I'm not giving a judgment here. I'm just telling you that countries like China and India will not accept a world ruled by America. It may be the best option for the world to be ruled by America instead of being ruled by Russia or being ruled by China. I don't know. But these countries, they strongly oppose this kind of hegemony of the United States. Yes, it takes a long time. And the last time there was a big change in leadership in the world was between Britain and the US. And this change in leadership didn't cause a war. The war came for other reasons. But the war came mostly because Germany overtook Britain as the largest economic power in Europe in 1908. So the rise of China, and China has now an industrial production that is much larger than the US. That is something that the US doesn't like, and they show it openly. And this creates, in my view, unnecessary tensions, increasingly. But you have to see the tragedy. It has been written about this already more than 100 years ago, that geopolitically, China and Russia should not be together. In other words, one should split them apart. But the neocons in the US, in their incredible stupidity and incompetence, have managed to cement a friendship between Russia and China. This is unique in history, that a group of people in government act entirely contrary to their interests. The interest of America would be to be friendly with Russia as a counterbalance to China military, or be friendly with China as a counterbalance to Soviet power. But no, what the US has managed, I mean, this is something for a Guinness Book of Record in geopolitical mistakes. What the US has managed to do to unite Russia and China is hard to believe, but you needed an American State Department to be this incompetent. They subsidized electric vehicles in Europe. Now they suddenly wake up and see that the Chinese can produce them much cheaper than their subsidized vehicle in Europe. So they have, of course, they're all interventionists, all of them. You can talk to any government official. He has become an interventionist. Nobody accepts a free market any longer. So now, having subsidized these industries, they have to protect them. It's a complete joke. And who suffers? The consumer.